Hello, and welcome to more Constellation interviews for our upcoming conference, the North American Systemic Constellations Conference, to be held this October 5th to 8th in Virginia Beach. And our theme for the conference is Bridging the Divide, Healing the Collective and Personal Soul. And today we have a very interesting interview here. I'd like to welcome Salome Raheim and Tanya Mena. And Tanya Mena likes to go by Mena. And their topic is healing the transgenerational traumas and violence of U.S. slavery. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you so much, Linda.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. So I wanted to start with a welcoming prayer to the ancestors. It's very short. Anything that we have today, may we share it and be in service and of benefit to all the ancestors. If we could just take a moment of silence, that would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's lovely. Okay, so tell us about your presentation.
So our presentation is about being a citizen of the world, basically, and not necessarily just African Americans, although each of us is a descendant of a slave that was brought here, not by our will. We were stolen. And that sits in your system for generations. And we are connected to those people by this technology, family constellations, as well as genetically. And this technology is particularly effective in bringing those ancestors close to us and feeling them in our bodies. And what we are hoping is that this workshop enables people to heal, to come to terms with some of the pain, and deal with some of the past. Salome, what would you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I would add that the process of the transatlantic slave trade created trauma for many, many people, not only those Africans who were stolen, but also those who participated in their capture, their transport, their selling at the auction block. And so our ancestors and those of us who are descendants, not only does that trauma sit in our systems, but it also sits in the systems of all those who participated either directly or also as witnesses. This was a very, very brutal and brutalizing system, and there was so much trauma and violence involved, and everyone who was in the area, in the country, everyone was affected in some way, and that trauma and its residuals continues to live with us, and it is the creator and the perpetuator of a lot of the dynamics that we are experiencing in society today. So our workshop is truly about healing the collective soul.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And were you going to say something, Linda?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that in the last couple of years, with the advent of the smartphones and the media attention on the deaths of the young Black men and women and people being stopped by the police, that this has become a topic that is at the fore. And people have become more vocal about it and more concerned And it seems to run the gamut of races, which is a really wonderful thing. That we are not relegated to just something that has to do with African Americans, but really does have to do with all of us as a whole, and that is the collective conscience. And we want to heal that, and we need to understand the past, what's the word I'm looking for? We need to understand how often these things that are perpetuated on one particular group have its effect on many of us. And actually, I was thinking about and reading about to get ready for this interview about the banning of slavery, the importation of the slaves in 1808. And it happened because people were thinking that the human rights violations were becoming incorrigible. And so they thought that to stop importing the slaves would reduce the slave trade. Well, yes, it did. It banned it. But there were already slaves here. And instead of building or eliminating that business, it actually made it an internal business. And we're going to Virginia. And Virginia was one of the proponents of taking this business from an international business and making it a homegrown business. And they started breeding slaves to increase the numbers and not importing them. And so for us to be going to Virginia Beach and staying at a place called the Founders Inn is going to be traumatic in itself. And to have African Americans there speaking about slavery and supporting the ancestors and supporting the land who remembers what it felt like to bring all these people there. And Africa to lose all these people, I think is very relevant. And I think speaks to the healing. It speaks to the bridging of the divide. It helps deal with the trauma. It helps even deal with the reparations that have not been financial, but perhaps are emotional. All of these, I think, are of benefit to all of us.
And Constellations is a perfect technology to address these intergenerational traumas across a wide range of people who were positioned differently and whose ancestors were positioned differently in relationship to human chattel slavery in the United States.
And everywhere, yes. This will be amazing. Yes, I was speaking to someone recently about how it lives in the perpetrator also, and their ancestors, and it's confusing because it's not obvious. These things were often suppressed, kept secret of their families' or ancestors' relationship to the trade of humans.
That's a very, very important point and speaks to why this workshop is important for everybody, no matter what their ancestral background might be. Because if you can imagine just the brutality of capturing, buying, and selling other human beings, but beyond that, the brutality and the violence that was necessary to keep this oppressive system in place, the brandings, the beatings, the mutilations or hangings if people tried to escape or did not act subordinate enough. So not only think about how that affected the people who were targets of this violence, and then think about what it did to the souls of the people who perpetrated the violence, and then think about what it did to those who witnessed the violence, the children of the slave owners seeing this kind of brutality, people who perhaps were against the slave trade, but felt powerless to do anything. And then there were the people who were against the slave trade and took a very active role in advocating for abolition, physically helping slaves to escape through a system called the Underground Railroad. The impacts of this very inhumane system, they're just tremendous. They're so far reaching. And one of the reasons this workshop is so important is because the trauma lives in us, and because many people think of slavery, certainly not people who do constellations, but people in the society at large think of slavery as a historical event that happened, it's over, let's move on. And therefore, slavery is not the residuals of slavery that live with us today and are showing up in the ways that Mena talked about. There's not a consciousness that there's a connection there, and it could be easy for a Constellations facilitator, for example, to miss dynamics that might be showing themselves that are rooted in these various aspects of slavery. And the facilitator might miss it, and certainly someone who's doing a piece of work may not, as you said, Linda, have any idea that this is that slavery and these traumas are a part of their ancestral system. So Constellations facilitators can make a wonderful contribution to the healing of the collective soul if they come to recognize what these traumas look like and how they may show up, so that these facilitators can effectively work with them.
Absolutely. And I also think that, unfortunately, when the Africans were brought here, they were stripped of everything. Their identities, the names that they received were in conjunction with the plantation that they lived on. Everything that could give them their own sovereignty, their language, their foods, their religion or spiritual practice, all those things were stripped from them. So they became the other. And in our society, as African Americans, we were thought of when we were slaves as the enemy, and we needed to be controlled. And that mentality is hard to leave once that pressure or those constraints are lifted. Slavery was lifted, but the slaves didn't know what to do. They had been owned for years and years and years, and suddenly they were free, and they end up being sharecroppers on land that they worked on and thinking that this is their freedom. We in America think that slavery ended hundreds of years ago, and that we are all acclimated and everything is fine. But if we look at the way children are reared, if we looked at the job situations, if we looked at housing, we see over and over how the equality that's supposed to be given and earned because the African Americans built this country, especially in the South, are not available. And so this transgenerational trauma continues, and the limitations continue. And we, in America, black and white, and all the mixtures of people, think that we're in a place that has a melting pot and the streets are paved with gold. But perhaps the gold is only limited to the 1% or just the few. And we want to be in a situation, and we want to help as facilitators open the doors so that more people can be welcomed in, and so that this mentality of other can be stripped away and everyone can belong. That's a tenet of family constellations and systemic constellations.
Mena, there's several things that you said that I want to comment on. One was about being stripped of our culture and our identity and being given identities related to the plantation holder. And I just want to use myself as an example. Although my name, Salome Raheim, is a name that I took on myself. I legally changed my name. The last name that I was born with is the name of the white plantation holders that owned my family, that enslaved my ancestors. That's a lot to live with. And as an example of what Mena is saying, because we were stripped of our culture, I have no idea, which is true of most African Americans in this country, I have no idea what my real ancestral names are. Really not a clue. The other thing that I wanted to comment on is about how slavery, in some ways, taking the words of Brian Stevenson, who is a human rights activist who focuses on these issues, slavery in some ways just evolved. It wasn't completely abolished. And there were laws that were passed to keep former enslaved people oppressed. And one, in addition to the killings of unarmed people of color, if we just look as far as the prison system and we look at the mass incarceration of people of color, even though African Americans are 13% of the US population, we are 60% of the prison population. That is a direct manifestation of the legacies of slavery. And if we are to resolve these issues, then this trauma and this violence that sits in all of our systems has to be addressed.
I agree. Absolutely.
This is going to be fascinating, ladies. Wow. Oh my gosh. Cool. Oh, I'm fascinated. Keep going.
Well,
okay. Go ahead.
I would say a few other things. This is even though this is a dynamic, we're talking about this dynamic in a context of people of European descent who have come to be called white and people of African descent who have come to be called Black. It's much more complicated than that because, again, using myself as an example, although I identify as African American, that is the culture and the community in which I was reared. I am, in terms of my ancestry and my DNA, I am African American, I'm English and Scandinavian, and I'm also Native American. Once again, because of the legacies of slavery, I know nothing about my European heritage except that I have it. And I know very, very little about my Native American heritage. And that's another kind of loss and another kind of trauma that many people sit with. Some people who are of primarily European descent can trace their ancestors back to their home country. That's something that many of us who are primarily African descent cannot do. And there's another piece of this complexity. There are many people who identify as white, think they're only white, who have African American ancestors. For some of them who know it, this is a secret. And some of them don't know this, and it is a source of family shame, and that shame lives in their system. And then there's also the issue of Native Americans, and then it becomes much more complex. There were sometimes very supportive relationships among people of African descent and the indigenous people who were already here. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the workshop that we do. So what I'm saying is this work, this healing work, isn't just about people of European descent or who think they're only of European descent, and people who are from African descent. The racism, and we really need to name that, the racism that emerged to support this system of oppression has impacted people of all ethnicities across the country and really across the world. So this is much bigger than what people like to see slavery as an event that happened in U.S. history.
Right.
Absolutely, and its ramifications and its socioeconomic effects are long-standing and long-lived. And we, in America especially, because we're supposed to have a democratic system, should be very open to challenging these things. And we seem to be just as comfortable and easy to be with the malaise of being in this oppressive, suppressive system. And when we all work together, we change it for the benefit of all. And energetically, we are one collective. We stand together and we make ourselves separate. But the truth is that that's not what happens. And the effect that we have on one another is something that can trickle down and trickle forward. I think of children who are in the 4th grade. I think that's when you start to learn about U.S. history and slavery. And what is it when a white child hears about slavery for the first time? And what is it when their black counterpart hears about that for the first time? What is that? What does that feel like in your system? And how in 4th grade do you handle that your best friend Charlie, whether he's black or white, was once owned by someone? These are things that we don't need to be suppressing. These are things that we need to be clearing. And as a body worker, I understand how this stuff lingers in your body. We talk about it when it comes to emotional issues, but we should be talking about it when it comes to genetic issues. We know that in people who have been descendants from the Holocaust, that this is a trauma that you carry. And in the Holocaust and after the Holocaust, there were all of these psychological components to help them deal with it. But there was nothing that was given to African Americans to deal with the ravages of slavery. And I'm not even talking financially, where the Japanese received money financially. The Holocaust victims received monies from the Europeans. And yet we in America don't want to even allow black people to have equal opportunities to jobs and educations. And we're talking about changing the affirmative action laws. But before affirmative action, black children were not being able to be educated in the same way that white children were, let alone have secondary education and postgraduate education and so forth. All of these things are the children of slavery, and this trauma keeps following us, all of us. And so this is part of what our workshop is about also, just coming to terms with what is, and standing in the truth of wanting to change what is, so that going forward we can all stand strong and tall and proud, and the history that maybe haunts some of us from shame or from neglect can be something that we are proud of.
This is going to be very exciting. Are you going to spend a little time at the beginning of your workshop laying out any history? Do you have a plan to do that, or how did you plan to structure your workshop?
Absolutely. we will lay out the history so that we all start on the same page, so to speak. The history that is taught in schools about slavery is it's fairly superficial.
Mhm.
And Mena and I felt that it was important to lay the historical foundation so that the the realities of the the oppression of slavery would be apparent, and also to name that so that we can then begin to work with it. I mean, the numbers of are staggering. Think of 14 million people being stolen from Africa, 2 million of them dying on the way here during the voyage. And when I say here, I mean the Americas. All of them didn't come directly to the United States. And then the 12 million that survived, what their lives were like, and what some of the laws were to keep slavery in this, to keep this oppressive system in place. To control that many people takes a lot of effort, violence, and brutality. So we want to make sure we lay the foundation and share details so that it's clear what this system did to the souls of the oppressed, the oppressors, and the witnesses.
Well, ladies, thank you so much. We're out of time at this point. I notice my Zoom is telling me we have 1 minute. So I want to thank you. I sincerely am looking forward to your workshop. This is going to be groundbreaking. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for inviting us to participate.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Thank you, Linda. And I just want to say a closing note that all of the processes that Mena and I will do in this workshop will be done with loving care.
Absolutely.
I trust that will happen. Thank you very much, ladies. It was a pleasure interviewing you. Salome Raheim.